Greetings to all of you, this is Dr. Lisa, and our discussion for today will be about realism theory, which is the dominant theory of international relations and the dominant tradition in the study of world politics since 1939 to the present moment. Realism theory attempts to explain mechanisms of international system and tries to analyze the essential causes of the intrastate conflicts. Writers and political theorists associated with realism claim to view the world as it is, not as it ought to be, like idealistic thinkers, where the outbreak of the Second World War has undermined the idealism theory as an approach to study international relations. Realism embraces a variety of approaches and claims a long theoretical tradition, where its roots can be found in some of the ancient writers, in which philosophers, leaders, and politicians has laid the foundation for the realistic theory. Some of the ancient thinkers often cited by theorists are Thucydides, in the history of Peloponnesian War, which gave a partial account of the armed conflict between Athens and Sparta that took place from 404 to 431, where Thucydides attributed the victory of Sparta over Athens during the war to the power element, that the strong will rule over the weak because they have the power to do so, meaning that the strong will exercise their power over the weak at the end. This work can be described as an important source or text for theorists of international relations. It is more than just chronology of events, as theoretical positions can be extrapolated in the field of international relations studies. The work referred to the core themes of realism, such as anarchy, balance of power, and security dilemma. The second ancient thinker in classical realism is Niccolò Machiavelli. The most prominent works of Machiavelli are The Prince and the Discourses, in which he attended the central problem of politics. He explained how the basic human characteristic or nature can influence the security of the state. He opposed confusing morality into politics and was advocator to the pragmatic thrust, which translate into what we have known nowadays as Machiavellianism, which become as a doctrine. He recommended two strategies for a statesman to practice foreign policy, which are the power represented by the lion and the deception represented by the fox. To protect the state interests and survival, he also proposed that the ruler should ensure both domestic and international politics, since the prince is responsible for internal and international affairs, which is anarchic in nature, thus requires a powerful, strong, wise, brave, and when necessary, ruthless leader. Machiavelli separates ethics from politics, because it can't be rigidly applicable to politics. That's why the ruler must apply pragmatic in the way that he manages the state affairs. The third thinker that we have is Thomas Hobbes. In his work Leviathan, Hobbes spoke about the state of nature. According to Hobbes, the state of nature recognized as the war of every man against every man. It is a continuous violent status of rivalry and competition, in which each person has a natural right to do everything and anything to achieve his own interests, irrespective of the interests of the other. Hobbes called that as the first law of nature. He attributed the state of nature to the absence of the common power or the global power to enforce peace, security among the different political units to solve disputes as well. To put an end to this insecurity status, he suggested that individuals should agree upon a social contract to concede their natural rights to one sovereign higher authority, which is the Leviathan, to protect the national security of the state. That will shift the human from the pre-civil status into the civil sovereign political state. Using the terminology of realism, Hobbes has suggested to find a solution for the security dilemma amid anarchic system is to restore to the general rule of reason by subordinating individuals to the common power or the sovereign, in the sense that ruler has the ultimate power to enforce peace and security. Having spoken about the intellectual roots of realism school, which is known as the classical realism, let's now see how does the classical realism evolve to become as an approach to study international politics. Realism started a self-awareness of being a school of thoughts in the study of international relations, emerged during the mid-20th century, and was inspired by the British historian and the political scientist Edward H. Carr. In his work, The 20 Years' Crisis, published in 1939, Carr studied the international politics during the period of two world wars and pushed for what is known as the first debate in the field of international relation theory versus idealism, in which Carr argued that the study of international relations should be based on the reality and not how the reality should be. He attacked idealism and considered it as a deluded and dangerous of the liberal internationalists. Accordingly, he considered one of the classical realism founders. Carr pointed out that there is no harmony of interests among states. Rather, there are conflicts of interests. That makes the states always seek to increase their power to protect their self-interest and national security. So as you can see that Carr has paved the way for the realist ideas in the period between the two world wars, while the outbreak of the Second World War convinced many scholars to convert to the realism vision. Here we can notice that realism started to be established in the political science department in the studying of international relations. In the forefront of realist thinkers is Hans Morgenthau. Through his work Politics Among Nations, the Struggle for Power and Peace in 1948, Morgenthau helped to establish the general theoretical framework for realism. It considered as an essential exposition of the realist theory of international relations. Morgenthau has put 6 principles of international politics. First one being, politics is governed by objective laws that have their roots in human nature. Therefore, it is essential to understand these laws and build a rational theory of international politics. For knowing these objective laws, we have to study the history of human relations to understand the behavior of the statesman in order to understand international politics. Second principle given by Morgenthau is the national interest defined in terms of national power, meaning that nations always define and act for securing their national interests by means of power. National interest is always secured by the use of national power as the central fact of politics. Thus, statesmen should avoid 2 fallacies. First one, the concern with motives, and the concern with ideological preferences. In political realism, mostly the good motives might lead to unsuccessful policies, while policies based on the power and national interest are more certain to be successful in the practical terms. This principle extended to the ideology as well. Ideology might be used as a cover to conceal the nationalistic power politics of the state. Therefore, judging the actions of the state in terms of ideology or motives might be misleading. In short, as a political realist, if you want to analyze a conflict or the rivalry powers, try not to take the ideological motives as the main and the only reason for the conflict. Rather, you have to look at the conflictual interests of these powers. For example, the rivalry between Gulf countries and Iran in Middle East. In power politics, giving one explanation or analyzation which is based on Sunni versus Shia conflict would be superficial and misleading and won't give you answers to your questions as a researcher. Same goes for the Cold War conflict between USA and the former USSR. Third principle suggested by Hans Morgenthau is the universal validity of interests. meaning that there is a universal validity of the concept of interest, defined in terms of power. Therefore, the actions and the policies of the nation are always governed by its national interest. Putting in mind that the changing nature of national interests of a state according to the historical, political, cultural, or international dynamics. Understanding political realism requires a constant analysis of the national interests and national power, which is always decide the frames, the scopes, and the areas of relations among nations. Fourth, abstract moral principles can't be applied to politics. The trajectory of a state politics, according to Morgenthau, should be the securing national interest by means of national power. Justice and morality can't be applied to the actions of the state, as there is a tension between morality and the successful political actions. Moral principles don't guide policies and actions of the state. These are simply to be used to save the national interest when it is required. For example, see the US invasion of Iraq in 2003 was under the plea of spreading democracy and freedom. US and the Western arming the rebels against the Syrian government in 2011. The war was under moral values of bringing justice and freedom to the Syrian people. Arming and supporting Ukraine by US and the West against Russia under the humanitarian pretext, moral values, and freedom. See, in all the previous examples, US didn't reveal the real intentions, reasons, or interests in taking these actions, while international relations scholars can take realism approach to explain, analyze these actions to explain world politics. This principle leads us to the next one, which is differentiating between moral aspirations of the nation and the universal moral values or principles. As I mentioned in the previous examples, US and the West can't cover their national interests under the cloak of moral principles and impose it on the world as a universal morals should be followed and applied. The policy of a nation as such can't be confused and shouldn't be equated with the universal moral principles. For instance, the US anti-terror policy is governed by its own national interests and not for the sake of making the world a better place or safer place for democracy and freedom. Last principle given by Hans Morgenthau is politics is an autonomous sphere. Political realism has its distinctive moral attitude toward political sphere. As Morgenthau has put it, and I am quoting, "A man who was nothing but political man would be a beast, for he would be completely lacking its moral restraints. A man who was nothing but moral man would be a fool, for he would be completely lacking in the prudence." End of the quote. Meaning that political realism is neither idealistic nor legalistic, and even not moralistic in its approach to study international politics. It's concerned with the national interest, defined in terms of power, as its sole concern. Now let's try to summarize the most important ideas in realism theory. Starting from human nature. Human nature is, according to realists, are self-centered, evil, selfish, competitive, and power-longers. That means that war-like condition in international relations is essentially the result of the human nature, which is violent, manipulative, and seeks power after power. This pessimistic vision, traced as I mentioned before in Thucydides, Thomas Hobbes, Machiavelli, and Hans Morgenthau work. Morality from realism lens has limited function at international politics level. As the state has its national interests and national security to secure, realism doesn't confuse international ethics with the state behavior, action, and politics. States should be good when they can, but they must also be willing to use violence when necessary to guarantee its security and survival. For Morgenthau, political action can be considered as a moral one also, because ultimately it aims at the survival of the state and securing its citizens' safety. Third, the premises of realism is that the nation-state is the primary actor in international relations and the main unit of analysis, while other actors, such as international organizations, considered to be secondary actors. They also suggested that the state constitutes a coherent single actor, represents on one main voice on the external affairs level, irrespective of having different centers of power or even divergence of voices within the one state. It will remain the only and the one cohesive actor at the highest level degree of the sovereign authority at the international level. Fourth premises that realism theory has given us is the state is a rational actor, acts in an anarchic system according to its national interests to ensure and maximize power and to achieve national security. When the issue of survival constitutes the main determination of the state's behavior, and the word of anarchy, self-help scenario, is prevailing. The international system, according to realism theory, is anarchic, meaning that there is no one central power or government that rules the international system. The international arena is therefore dangerous and uncertain, where the order and stability always being the exception rather than the rule. According to realism, the struggle for power is the essence of international relations. As stated by Hans Morgenthau, global politics is all about power and self-interest. This is why realism often described as a power politics model of international politics. It can be manifested by the following quote by Hans Morgenthau. Politics is a struggle for power over men, and whatever its ultimate aim may be, power is its immediate goal and the modes of acquiring. Maintaining and demonstrating it determine the techniques of political action. Having spoken about the most important ideas in classical realism theory, let's now shift and see some of its limitations or critics. First, realism viewed international politics as a constant struggle for power. Depending on the hypothesis that a human is power-seeker creature, the validity of this assumption can be questioned, as the character of a human nature can't be generalized or revealed by observation and experiment, and it can't be also proven through any other experiment research. The power as the basic concept of a classical realism is vague. It's not clearly defined, so it can't be determined the nature of international politics in the way that realism claims. It doesn't allow us to understand the behavior of the states in the light of the ideological motives and preferences of their political leaders. And that's why it can't serve as a basic for defining politics as an independent field. Last criticism we can say about classical realism is that not all states follow the same foreign policy. We can't define the state behavior exclusively with the power, security, or the national interests. International politics can't be studied in isolation from the broader political, historical, and cultural context of the state and its relation with the others. With that, I will be concluding my lecture for today, in which I have examined classical realism. In the coming lecture, we will discuss the new realism theory, which is an attempt to build a more scientific approach to study international relations. And we will examine the commonalities and differences between both classical realism and new realism theory. See you next time.